heard people refer to the Gilded Age as laissez-faire, okay? And I hear this term a lot. And and just really, like, anytime I hear it, I get almost triggered, like borderline triggered, and I'm not here to cancel the Gilded Age laissez-faire, but I want to kind of think in terms of how laissez-faire was. Okay, so any kind of question that we're looking at, evaluate the extent is usually what we're looking at when we look at a DBQ or LEQ. So, for example, it's not like, was the Civil War about slavery, or was it about states' rights, or was it about economics? But evaluate the extent to which, okay? Evaluate the relative importance of different causes. So that's what we're always thinking about here. And so with this, Johnny, you share a birthday with George Washington. Yes, all right, that is a win right there. Okay, so it looks like about 3/4 of you, you've heard the Gilded Age referred to as laissez-faire. So let's think about what we would do here in terms of evaluating this claim, because so often we don't necessarily, look at this in terms of we take things and then we don't necessarily put them into evidence. So one thing that we need to do is we need to define laissez-faire economics. Okay, so first of all, so this could be an LEQ prompt. This is a format that we could see there. So with that, so basically defining key terms, okay? This is always step one. So if you ever see something, you need to think about, first of all, what does this mean? So let's think about our definitions of laissez-faire, okay? So go ahead, and I want to see this in the comments. How would you define laissez-faire, okay? And Aria, I'm going to ask you to kind of lay off the long chat. So as far as that goes, when we look at laissez-faire, so if we're going to define that, okay, so laissez-faire, okay, so fair means like little to no, so basically very limited government intervention in the economy, right? So very limited government intervention in the economy. What we've seen here is hands off, okay, hands off. Literally, let it be, okay? And this is, I would say, like the government does little more than punish criminals, okay? And that sort of thing. Like when somebody does something like that's obviously wrong, so punish criminals, like that would be, for example, fraud and that sort of thing. So what we need to do here is, in order to write our LEQ, we need to start thinking about, compiling our evidence. Okay, so if we're going to make an argument that it was laissez-faire, then we have to think in terms of, okay, what is our evidence, or that it wasn't. So what I'm going to do here is laissez-faire and not laissez-faire. Okay, so, not laissez-faire. So we need to kind of think about that and putting our evidence together that's going to support our argument. So going from there, let's think about this. When we say that the Gilded Age was laissez-faire, then we need to think about this. Okay, so what we're going to note here is there was little regulation of corporations, right? So basically there was little regulation of large corporations, okay? Now, with that, so we would say that there's very limited regulation, okay? There's not a lot of regulation, and I think that's what we see there. Now, with that, one thing that Danny is talking about here, I want to actually look what we see there with what Danny mentioned here, and I love you too, Herman. And so with that, let's think about government control of interstate commerce. I'm going to go ahead and put here, is that laissez-faire when government intervenes in a strike? Okay, so if we're going to look here, when the government intervenes against strikers, is that it's so hard to spell laissez-faire, okay? So when we think about the government intervening against strikers, let's see what y'all have to say about that. Is that laissez-faire? There is a strike, and then the government says, okay, go back to work or we're going to shoot you, which is basically what they did during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And so so that's the thing, that on one side, we make this claim, but then there are things that go against that claim. So we see here, we are nearly unanimous, okay, that is not laissez-faire. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was a little more laissez-faire when he told the coal strikers and the coal managers and executives, he said, come to the White House and let's talk. That sounds a little more laissez-faire to me. So when we think about this, we can think about the strike-breaking policies, okay? So we see these strike-breaking policies, okay? And this happened in the Great Railroad Strike, okay? And the Pullman Strike, okay? And what they did is that the government used the Commerce Clause, okay? So the federal government used the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which puts the federal government in charge of interstate commerce, okay? In order to intervene against the strikers. And there's no point during the Gilded Age where you see like, oh, the government is acting like as an umpire. That's part of the reason that Teddy Roosevelt comes around later and says, I'm going to offer a square deal. Now, one thing that I want to note here, little regulation of large corporations. On the other hand, can we think of some regulations of large corporations? So one thing that I'm going to put here is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, so the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, and then the Interstate Commerce Act. Okay, now we could argue that the Sherman Antitrust Act was a weak piece of legislation, but at the same time, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft used the Sherman Act to break up the Northern Securities whatever that was. Yeah, the Northern Securities Trust, and then Taft broke up Standard Oil with the Sherman Act. So it was not as strong as the Clayton Antitrust Act, but it was there, and it was used sometimes, even though we'll note here that the Sherman Act was also, mostly used against labor unions, okay, unions prior to 1900, okay? And so this is something where the government is constantly coming in against the labor unions. So there's minimal regulation, okay? Now, another thing that we could note here, we could look in terms of taxation, okay? So on one hand, there was no income tax, okay? And we see here an 1894 tax was struck down by the Supreme Court. That's why during the Progressive era, there is a constitutional amendment, okay? So we see here no income tax, but let's think about this. Protective tariffs, okay? What do we know about the protective tariffs? Now, the Wabash case, the written test, right? That's one of them I have to look up. Which one of the questions I got here was about, let's see, so I did answer some things here. Okay, well, I shared the Google Doc with you. I've already shared that, but I'll share that again. And again, some of y'all may not be able to access it right now, but you can keep the link and access it later, okay? So as far as that goes, this is our link. Oh, you know what? I already sent this message. Okay, so let me try this. Google Doc. Okay, and let me do that. Okay, so that'll let me send that. So one thing that we want to note here is I'm going to address Jay's question here. Methods, tips to keep up with all the dates, policies, key terms. Okay, so somebody asked me about the Wabash case. Wabash, I don't know. But basically, that's one of those things that it's an illustrative example. Like, I'm actually having to look it up, okay? So what we see sometimes is that, we see different cases. Now, I had to look it up. Now, here's the thing. Not even I as a teacher know every single thing that happened, okay? And so what you want to do is pick some things that are going to be helpful, okay? Don't try to memorize every single thing that happens, but pick the ones that you want to look at. So the Wabash case, if that's what you want to use, because this is something that's actually like it's interfering with the state's ability to regulate. Okay, so basically, and we see the Interstate Commerce Commission was a result of that. But as far as that goes, make sure that you think about, like, what are some things that I can know that are essential? some things that understanding that I don't have to know every single thing that happens. Sometimes we're trying to pack too much into our brains. And it's going to do better if you think about like getting 3 things that you know really well, rather than having 10 things that you can do like a little bit more than, just a little bit more than name. Okay. So that's what I would say here, that you want to say here that, okay, so you don't actually have to remember presidencies in sequence. That's another thing. Now, there are some, for example, like Rutherford B. Hayes coming after Ulysses S. Grant, but you don't have to know who was president after Rutherford B. Hayes. In fact, what they say about the Gilded Age, it is an age of what are called forgettable presidents, okay? So that's something that you want to think about too. So let's think about this as well. Now, if we're going to think in terms of, protective tariffs, okay? Protective tariffs, laissez-faire or not laissez-faire, okay? So we're going to say here are protective tariffs, okay? Laissez-faire, okay? So are protective tariffs laissez-faire, yes or no, okay? And let's see what y'all say about this. Okay, so if we think about the protective tariff system, are we going to put that, are we going to say that? And we know that protective tariffs are not. So on one hand, somebody might say, and again, I'm not saying the Gilded Age is not laissez-faire. I am saying that, we want to evaluate this claim and we want to challenge it and see if it stands up to scrutiny. And so what we're going to think here is, on one hand, there's no income tax. Now, y'all notice that I've got some things that kind of stay on their own, but then I've also got some things that, if I'm going to say this, then I'm going to put protective tariffs, okay? Now, where, the way that I tend to look at this, and this is the way I look at it, I mean, it's not, that's the beauty of history, it's like we're piecing this together in a way that makes sense to us individually, is when we look at all this stuff, we're starting to see a pro-business kind of mindset, and there's a difference between laissez-faire, which is really like the Jacksonian kind of like, look, hands off, rather than here, the protective tariffs were designed to help, industry and business, okay, at the expense of agriculture, okay? So this is really the first time in history that we've seen, we've seen something here where it is, where agriculture is not the business that's being, that's being given the most attention. And so what we want to note here, the Interstate Commerce Act regulated the railroads, okay? So it regulated the railroads. And so we want to note here, we've seen the, we've seen the strike breaking. Now, another thing we could note here is if we think about social Darwinism, okay, and the gospel of wealth, okay? And both of these are kind of tied to, that there shouldn't be a lot of regulation and that sort of thing. But, the problem here is that when you look at a lot of these things, it's not that the government's being laissez-faire, it's that the government is basically playing favorites. Now, another thing I want to note here is in a laissez-faire economy, what we want to note here is a laissez-faire economy is not a corrupt economy. Like, laissez-faire, like if you go back to Adam Smith, it's like, of course the government is supposed to prosecute fraud. Of course the government is supposed to keep people honest. And so another thing that I would note here is that there was toleration of corruption, okay? And we could look at all kinds of things here. So going into that, like you could actually look up like on there's a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to scandals of the Ulysses S. Grant presidency. And so this is one of those things, if you think about credit mobilier scandal, and things like this. Now, the other thing that we want to note here is the railroads, okay? So this is another thing that we want to think about is railroad subsidies, okay? So when we think about credit mobilier, why was the credit mobilier scandal possible, okay? The credit mobilier scandal was possible because you have this subsidizing, okay? So, railroad subsidies, okay, that these are basically land grants, by government, to private corporations. Okay. So with that, this is something that, again, this is an exercise here in not saying that they were or they, the Gilded Age was or wasn't laissez-faire, but to what extent did it influence? So what we want to think about here is our choices, okay, when we have a prompt like this, are, did laissez-faire, fair economics, influence economic policy during the Gilded Age to a great extent or to a limited extent, okay? So to a great extent or to a limited extent. And that's what we want to think about, here. Now, another thing that we could note there as well, we think about social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth, like, this basically discouraged social welfare, okay? So basically government sponsored social welfare programs, okay? So that's another thing that we could say, that's something that there wasn't any kind of federal social welfare. Now, in most countries at that time there wasn't, but any of y'all who took AP Euro, y'all feel free to own that in the chat. For any of y'all who took AP Euro, you remember Otto von Bismarck, like during this time created the first like welfare state in like a Western country around this time. Okay. So just tell your teacher that, say Richey's trying to get to Rome, Georgia. So with that, what we want to do here is we're not going to go like when you're thinking about framing your thesis, like, and again, I'm not going to tell you, nobody owes you the complex understanding point, but the way that we go about trying for the complex understanding point is we avoid the no man's land in the middle. Okay. And then we avoid the two extremes. Okay. So we avoid the two extremes. Okay. And, the teacher's here. Awesome, Luke. Glad to hear that. And so we avoid the extremes. We don't say it was totally influenced by laissez-faire. We don't say it wasn't influenced, and then we don't go 50-50. We either go here or we go here. If you don't, okay, let's not go down the complex understanding rabbit hole. Okay. It is a point on the essay that very few people end up earning. There's not really a set formula or anything, anything there. So with that, and Krista Wallace, where is your school? And so let's see, would love is that the name of the school or, okay, because it's apostrophe S. Okay. So let me go ahead and take a question before we go with that. Political machines and their influence on, let's see, as far as, Miami. Okay, yeah, I tell you, I'd love to get back down to Miami. That's another thing before the whole pandemic started. I was doing like an annual event in Miami. I would love to get back to that. So that's something that, if a school in Miami wants to try to host a live event, I'm all about listening to that. So Luke, okay, is asking political machines and their influence on societal norms. So one thing here, and this isn't directly tied to the economy, but let me just go ahead and note what a political machine is. Okay, so an immigrant gets off the boat and they don't speak much English. They practice, they're not Protestant. They, don't have an education and they're kind of looking around. And then there's somebody, hey, all right, yep, you're Polish. I can bring you to a Polish neighborhood. Okay. And they bring you to a Polish neighborhood. And they bring you to one of the tenements there, and they help you settle in, and they're like, how would you like a job? Well, sure thing, I'd love a job. And so they get you a job. You've got an apartment, you've got a job, you start going to church with all these nice people, and then one day, there's a knock at the door. And it's this guy that helped you find all that stuff, and, you're all settled in, and it's like, hey, we know that we can count on you to vote our way on election day. Okay, and this was before, remember the populists, they're wanting the secret ballot. And so as far as that goes, yeah, Boss Tweed was the head of the Tweed ring, okay, Tammany Hall in New York City. And so the way these things worked, and typically it would be the Democratic Party, which makes sense because, now I'm not talking about like the modern Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party then, this makes sense because Thomas Nast, which, he he was one of the most famous cartoonists, maybe the most famous cartoonist of his time during this time. And he was a cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, which was a mainstream Republican. It was a moderate Republican paper in New York. And so Thomas Nast, which some of my students will remember it, they call him Thomas Nasty, which they think that's funny. I'm like, okay, that's fine, whatever. But Thomas Nast, a lot of the cartoons that you look at from this time, you start to see his kind of distinctive style. So with this, one thing, so we want to note there that the political machines, it was something that basically we make sure you get a job, we make sure you get a place to stay, and then we want your vote, okay? And that basically leads to political corruption because people are voting because they're getting favors and patronage, not because of who's going to do a better job. So with that, what I want to note here, one thing that we need to make clear. Okay, so I see here that Jackson is asking, but didn't big business only thrive the wealthy nation, not the poor? The poor couldn't afford any of the goods while the wealthy could. Okay, so let's say, granted, check. Okay, but let's take what you've said here, Jackson, and let's put this into any place, any time in the history of the entire world. So what we're going to do here, Jackson, is we're going to ask, like, Jackson, you can go back to any time you want, but you're going to have to be poor. Where do you want to go? And to which, Jackson, you're more than likely going to reply, I don't want to be poor. Okay? Because there's really no time or place when it's good to be poor. Now, I will tell you, it sucked to be poor during the Gilded Age. I mean, I think any time I don't want to be poor, but at that time especially, but here's the thing. This is another thing that I want to challenge here, that we've got this whole thing like the captains of industry, or the robber barons, okay? Sometimes we hear this term robber barons, and what it makes it sound like is that John D. Rockefeller came in and stole from people, okay? People like Rockefeller and Carnegie, they came in and stole from the American public, that basically, that as far as like, you were taking money from me to build your fortune. But with that, so what we want to note, Jasmine, you're onto something here, is that the Gilded Age was a bad time to be poor, but not only did that, so the gap between rich and poor increased, but also the middle class increased during this time. So you do see a thriving middle class. You've got people with a lot of money, but then again, it is a bad time to be poor. But then again, well, see, here's the thing, Jay, that's a judgment call. Rockefeller was a robber baron. That is a judgment call. That is a historical judgment. I can't tell you that Rockefeller was or was not a robber baron. But what we have to ask ourselves here, is, are we better off because of these big entrepreneurs, or are we worse off? Did they take from us, or did they create economic growth? And so what we have to think about here is before Rockefeller. Okay, so if we're going to think about this, I love these little graphic organizers here. Okay, so oil before Rockefeller, and then oil after Rockefeller. Okay, so the thing is that oil before Rockefeller was expensive and might blow up. Okay, I'm not making this up. Might blow up. I had some students tell me one time that when you drive up to the gas station, like, there are like 80 vehicles a year that explode at the gas pump. Now, I've never gone and verified this, okay? But there aren't enough vehicles that explode at the gas pump to make people like, okay, I'm going to start to pump my gas, and then I'm going to run off, okay? And so as far as that goes, we feel safe pumping our gas, okay? Expensive, might blow up, okay? Much cheaper, okay? And won't blow up. Okay, so here's the thing, that John D. Rockefeller got very rich, but in the meantime, the price of oil was much cheaper, and John D. Rockefeller had this refining process. It won't blow up. I think they needed stickers back then. How many of y'all seen those stickers? Okay, so when Andrew Carnegie, wrote The Gospel of Wealth, and I'm pretty sure that Carnegie was like an atheist or an agnostic. He was not religious. So when he says The Gospel of Wealth, don't get that confused with the social gospel, which is something that's different and more kind of attuned to the progressive era. But the gospel of wealth, the good news of wealth, okay? So Carnegie, philanthropy, okay? He builds Carnegie Hall. He builds thousands of libraries, okay? And, all of these things, Carnegie Mellon University. So basically what happens here with philanthropy, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, they start giving money to all of these things, like to promote the arts, to promote education, and to promote public health. And so, this is something where Carnegie's like, don't tax the millionaires, because the millionaires, they know better how to allocate money than politicians did. Okay? And so that's the thing that, now, if you trust Congress more than Elon Musk, totally fine. But at least you understand the whole idea of the gospel of wealth. Okay? So there are some people like Elon Musk, I think this tax year will pay more taxes than any American has ever paid in 1 year. Elon Musk will pay in taxes. And part of that is just like, part of me is just sitting there looking at that like, what a waste, okay? Because Elon Musk probably could have allocated that better for the benefit of society than Congress. Now, that's just my opinion, but with that, that's the whole idea of the gospel of wealth. And so just take a look there, and let's go ahead and construct a thesis statement, okay? So looking at this here, we want to, okay, got it. Okay, so not by proportion, just by the total dollar amount. Okay, so I want to think about, like, Rockefeller got really rich, but because of Rockefeller, like, people were getting their gas cheaper, the gas didn't blow up, it was better. Standard Oil, okay? Standard Oil. Branding, okay? When we think about branding, Standard Oil, you knew it was good. You knew it met the standard, okay? And so I'll leave it up to Ida Tarbell to like savage John D. Rockefeller, which she did a very good job of. But I just want to kind of fill in some blanks there. So as far as that goes, what we could say here, we could frame our thesis in a few different ways. Now, we could do a simple thesis, okay? So we could do a simple thesis where we would say the Gilded Age, okay? So, economic policy, so laissez-faire economics had a big, had a large, great effect, a large effect, or significant, I like significant, effect on economic policy during the Gilded Age, okay, because there was limited regulation of business, okay, there was limited regulation of business, and there aren't, and there were not any, any policies in place to help, people who were struggling. Okay, so that's what we would note. There. Now that would be, I would call this simple thesis A. Okay, and so simple thesis A basically has a claim, and then it has two lines of reasoning. Okay, so what we have here is a historically defensible claim. Okay, and then we will see here because. Now note here because that is our big $5 word here, because that tells us these are our lines of reasoning. Okay, so I like two lines of reasoning. Okay, so limited regulation of business, and there were not any policies in place to help people that were struggling. So note here, you've got the claim followed by because and. Okay, and so going from there, let's look at simple thesis B. Okay, so as far as simple thesis B, laissez-faire, economics had a very limited impact, okay, on economic policy, okay, so during the Gilded Age, because, okay, so Gilded Age because, because government policies consistently helped big business, okay? We'll note here that the government, so let's see, okay. So the government repeatedly intervened in order to help big business, okay? Big business. And we'll note here that, let's see, so strike breaking, let's see, so toleration of corruption, let's see, so, so repeatedly intervene in order to help big business, and tariff policy, what I'm going to note here, intervened in order to break strikes, okay, so I'm going to note, so tariff policies in order to break strikes, okay, passed laws that were, that helped big businesses, okay, and then we'll note here like tax policies and stuff like that. So repeatedly intervene in order to break strikes and pass laws that help big business, okay? And so what I would do here when we start to think about like our evidence, okay? So we see here, because the government intervened in order to break strikes, okay? So we're going to put that there. And so again, let's see. So we see with that. Okay, whoa, oops, I did the letters, not the highlighting, okay. So what we're going to note here is we would divide this into body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2, okay? So we would say here that strike breaking, okay? So strike breaking, and then I could go into the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike, okay? And then we would look at here laws that helped business, okay? And then that's where I would go into the protective tariff, okay? And because I've done some, some pre-writing here, we see protective tariffs, and then I could go into railroad subsidies, okay? So railroad subsidies. And so, here we would say, and this is a simple one. Now, let's think about how we would do a complex thesis, okay? So laissez-faire, and then we would just add. In order to do a complex thesis, you would just add to the simple thesis, okay? Had a very limited impact on economic policy. And then I would put here a however clause, okay? So however, okay, and let me underline that as well. However, okay, and let me do the same thing with and here, okay? So however, and then that's our word that basically tells us we will have a counter argument. Okay, so we've made a very clear claim here, okay, had a very limited impact. However, social Darwinist philosophies were, did have some influence, in terms of not having some influence in limiting the government's involvement, okay? And so there, we would go into this, and this would give us like a third paragraph, okay? So this is basically like if we were going to do this, we would have a third paragraph, which would be dedicated to a counter argument, okay? So we've got strike breaking, and then we've got laws on, so we see here, so social Darwinist philosophies did have some influence, so we see social Darwinism. Okay, and so, when we go into this, we can say here that, no social welfare. And then we would also, explain social Darwinism. Okay, so explain social Darwinism, which, of course, I don't really have time to get into that. That's a loaded term as well. I think social Darwinism is another thing, kind of like the New South, that should be put in quotes. But basically, social Darwinism says that we need to, the government doesn't need to intervene too much. Things need to happen naturally, and, all of humanity is going to be better off if we just let things be. So that's something that, when we're thinking about this, and we'll call this complex thesis, okay, that would be what I would call a complex thesis, that it makes a two-part, it makes a claim supported by two arguments, and then it brings forward the counter argument. So it's looking at the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike as your best ones. So yeah, a thesis could be 2 sentences. It could be 3 sentences if you want to. There was one time I actually wrote a 3-sentence thesis on a sample essay. I wouldn't recommend it, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100. But all it says on the rubric is that the sentences need to be consecutive. Like, it can't be a sentence here and a sentence there. It all has to be together expressing one thought. Okay. So yes, and I like this thesis. Okay. The thesis, which is basically what I call a thesis, is the thesis makes 3 points. Okay. And I made those 3 points in 2 sentences.